The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Welcome back to The Divide. I'm Drew, and I've got Bill, and today we're here with Josh Rasmussen, who is a philosopher. And Josh, do you want to say a little bit about what it is you study, do, teach, are interested in?
Thank you, Drew. It's great to be with you guys. My interest has focused on sort of foundational aspects of reality. So my first kind of work in my career was about the causal structure of the world that we're in. So is there a fundamental cause that produces everything else? And then lately I've been thinking a lot about the nature of ourselves and consciousness, and thinking about trying to get to the foundations of our concepts of ourselves. So that would be kind of my area of focus.
Well, the question we have for you today, I think, is as it comes to foundations, should we believe in God as a foundation because of philosophy, or is there another reason? What do you feel about that? What do you think is sort of the foundation, again, I guess, for why we should believe?
I like that question because people who kind of know my work and my style know that I like to invite a first-person approach where each person sort of follows the light that they have from their perspective. So I'm always like very, very wary of saying like what we should believe. And this is like a core value that I have, because I do think that people, in a sense, should believe what looks the most plausible given their total experiences. And so then if you say, well, Josh, like, what do you think as a philosopher exploring different pathways of reason? Do you think that there are pathways of reason that kind of lead to certain interesting conclusions that address the big questions, right? Like, does God exist? Can we argue for that? Can we show that to be true? And there I would say that, I do find certain pathways compelling that would lead me to think that there is a causal structure to the world, and that there is a foundational reality, and that this foundational reality has certain characteristics that allow it to be a foundation of the things that we see. So we see material forms of different forms. We see a kind of mathematical landscape, like even in our own minds, like as we're reasoning through numbers. We witness our own thoughts and feelings. So somehow fundamental reality, I think, has to have the resources or the attributes that allow it to be a foundation for those things. And then in my view, kind of where I'm at, is that if I fill in its nature with a kind of like supreme nature, then it kind of makes sense to me that it would predict that reality would have those things or be more likely to have those things than if I instead fill it in other ways. But having said that, I mean, that's kind of like a sketch of maybe something that I've been thinking a lot about. I have just deep respect for people who are seriously interested in the truth, trying to understand the nature of reality and arrive at a different view. Again, because I think people have a total set of experiences that make different things plausible to them. So I guess maybe my short answer is no. I don't think we should. My short answer.
Do you think, but for you personally, has that part of what leads you to believe there is some supreme being, or however you would put it?
Yeah, for me, it is the case. And I know a lot of people maybe don't relate to this particular experience. They will tell me that, it's not arguments that really move people. They're maybe moved by more emotional or experiential considerations. But for me, there was like an experience with thinking through the causal structure of things that, I can tell you about the parts in my mind that began to change as I was following these particular pathways. And I would test them out and invite others to help me sort of look at them more carefully. And so I feel like I'm always kind of updating my thinking on things. But yeah, absolutely, I would say that arguments have played a huge role for me in my story.
So it almost sounds like you're saying in the end, really, it's not
philosophy, so to speak? Like, there's not this pure way objectively to pursue philosophy that, if done rightly, would lead you to belief in God or the conclusion that something like God exists. But really, in the end, it's your sort of experience and your journey behind it that philosophy fits into that probably determines whether you're going to believe or not.
Yeah, something like that. But I want to just elaborate a little bit about this, because I do think that there's like a correct answer to questions. I think there's a reality, and people can get things objectively wrong. And I also think that there are ways to see certain things. So, for example, in mathematics, you could deduce a theorem from certain starting premises. And then you could think, oh, that theorem is true because those starting premises are true, you know, the axioms of numbers or whatever it is. But then somebody else could come along, and in the philosophy of mathematics, this is very interesting to me. It kind of blows my mind, but also helps me to understand how you can have rational disagreement over things that people can actually feel quite certain about, but there can still be reasonable disagreement. So in the philosophy of mathematics, there's what's called fictionalism. So fictionalists, one motivation for fiction, they say the mathematical statements are false. So you can't actually prove that the theorem is true because the starting points are false. And you might wonder, well, why would somebody be a fictionalist? Well, one motivation I've seen offered for this is that people have argued that if these mathematical statements are true, they would have to correspond with or describe an abstract mathematical landscape. And that this abstract mathematical landscape, they think, for other reasons, couldn't exist because it's abstract. And they have arguments for that in their mind that are more compelling than thinking that these first principles are true, right? And so then they'll say, well, you know, what is true is just if these things are true, you know, then these things would come out true, but it's actually false. And that kind of, I like that because it illustrates for me that probably most people, you know, listening to this are probably going to think, well, I think it's true that 2 + 2 = 4. And if there's anything that I feel certain of, like maybe that would be an example. And I think that there can be reasonable disagreement even there. But that doesn't mean you can't objectively have knowledge. And so that's what I want to clarify is, like, I think you can have knowledge in the face of reasonable disagreement. You don't have to choose between those. It seems to me.
I'm curious how you would. I don't want to go too far down a tangent or a rabbit hole, but like it seems, and I'm a skeptic, so but it seems to me that 2 + 2 pretty much equals 4, and I don't want to ask you to go too deep into the math, but in general, if someone's going to argue against that, isn't that a relatively simple thing to? Wouldn't you say that the consensus among humans is that that's true? And if so, how is it rational to argue against that? I'm just curious what you mean.
Yeah. So I would say that is a consensus. Human beings would see that it's true, and I do think that it's reasonable to think that. And I think that you say that you're a skeptic, so there are skeptics of 2 + 2 = 4, right? And how do they arrive at that skepticism? One reason has to do with the implications of 2 + 2 = 4 being true. So there's this view, one way of characterizing this view is to say that everything is concrete and has causal powers if it exists. So if it exists, it's concrete and has causal powers. And then some people have argued that if 2 + 2 = 4, if that's actually true, the truth of that is going to be made true by something that's abstract and doesn't have causal powers. And therefore, if everything has causal powers, if it exists, then it can't be true that 2 + 2 = 4. And then you say, well, okay, but help me understand why somebody would think that everything is concrete. Well, I think the best way to motivate this is by pointing to a parallel kind of debate that happens in the philosophy of mind. And it's over materialism, the idea that everything's fundamentally like made of matter somehow. And some people have been persuaded, so Alexander Rosenberg, a brilliant philosopher of science, has made the argument that if materialism is true, then he thinks that there would be no thoughts as we understand them in our own minds. And the reason for that, he makes this argument that physics describes the fundamental aspects of matter, and that these descriptions of the fundamental aspects of matter can't, through recombination, result in a description of what we know inside of our minds as thoughts. So here I'm using the language we know, but let me be more modest about it. What I take myself to know, because here's my point, is that you might expect Alexander Rosenberg then to make the argument that materialism is not true, because materialism can't account for thoughts on his view, on his own view. But he doesn't take that route. He takes the route that there are no thoughts. So he's kind of famous for making this argument in his book. I think it's called An Atheist's Guide to Reality. Now, I'm not saying he's representing, most materialists or anything like this, but it does illustrate that you can have reasons for a worldview that you are weighing in your mind that have certain implications. And once you follow the implications, now you have to weigh, okay, what are the reasons for thinking everything's fundamentally material? Well, that explains the success of science. We have no clear counterexamples. Oh, what about thoughts? Well, do you know that you have thoughts? Well, that's based on introspection. Is introspection reliable? And so now you run into this debate where on the one side you have those who are questioning skeptics of the existence of thoughts, and then others who are believers in the existence of thoughts. And that kind of a debate, I like to focus on that because I think most people, that's not where their divide is. They're not dividing over whether there's thoughts or whether 2 + 2 = 4. But I think if you can see the structural similarities between those debates, and then other debates that maybe more people would have, let's say the existence of God, then I think that it shows a certain pattern where people can have reasonable disagreement. The people who are arguing for everything being fundamentally material, they're making arguments from science that they make a lot of sense to me. It's very reasonable. It doesn't mean that I have to agree with them because I'm weighing other arguments as well. Does that kind of help a little bit, Drew, or what do you think about any of that?
One thing I was considering is, I had a math teacher one time put a proof on the board that 0 = 1, and no one could find the error in the proof.
I remember that.
And it just made me, and I think the error was like a divide by 0 error. And so the point is, when we take 2 + 2 = 4 and we try to extrapolate it and extrapolate it and extrapolate it from apples to universes or quarks, I think the error is in the extrapolation, and I do think it's a real actual error. And when you talk about sort of material, immaterial, those, to me, it seems like not necessarily that we can both be right in our own lens, but that there is an error being made somewhere in the extrapolation.
Yeah, I agree there would be an error, that there is a right answer. But I think that people can be sort of reasonable from their perspective in thinking that they have the right answer. So that's why I make this distinction between being right and being reasonable. So I think there can be two people, they're both perfectly reasonable from their total experiences and considerations. They try to share their experiences and considerations with each other, let me point you out the error. And it doesn't work because then the other person's saying, well, but what about these considerations? And they're working to understand each other. There is a right answer. Somebody's made a mistake, but it's hard to really figure out.
They're not speaking the same language.
They're not speaking the same language, or they have different experiences, and that's where it just takes work to sort of untangle the source of that. Yeah,
that's fascinating. Yeah, I agree.
Do you think this is why Christians, early Christians, but then especially in Dante's Divine Comedy, which you don't have to know a ton about, but Socrates, Aristotle, people like that, their culpability seems to be much lower, right? They're not getting punished. For people who aren't familiar with it, there's circles, of judgment, and the lower you go down the 9 circles, the more severe your punishment, and the implication is you were more culpable and your evil was greater for the types of evil you did. So is this kind of what you think lies behind that idea, even if you're not familiar with the Divine Comedy, but just the idea that you have people who are, I guess they're reasonable so far as they could see, but even if they're wrong? Is that kind of the way you see that?
And the way I think people will measure it, we can't help but do this, but we'll say, well, you're reasonable because, as far as you can see, as far as the knowledge you have, because you don't have my knowledge, right? That's kind of like the arrogant way of thinking about it. But like, we can't really help that, right? Like, if you had all of my information, then you would see the error. But you're totally reasonable for not seeing the error because, of course, you're ignorant of my information. But that's not very helpful, I think, like in conversation. I think really what I find most helpful is to just stay curious and just think, well, I could be the one who has the error, so what am I missing, right? Yeah.
I think that's what's behind a lot of Drew and my friendship and conversations in the podcast is that we feel like a lot of the time we pretty much have the same information. I don't think either of us are of such high expertise in one area that we would claim a kind of, information. We don't hog information to ourselves, and then that makes us see things better, even though we come out different on the question of God. Even
I think that's a great phrase that you said, Josh, that I would very much take on as a mantle, and that is, maybe I'm the one who has the error in everything I think. Going back to that proof, it's like it seems right as far as I can, figure out, as far as I can follow the math, and then, but I'm pretty sure I have the error, all the way up to, I think I'm right. I don't think there is an error, but
I might be wrong. Yeah.
It's hard to live like that, though. Like, it's hard to live on a daily basis with, tectonic plates that sit underneath the way you look at everything every day, as if that's all just kind of provisional.
I know. Well, I mean, there are people who challenge the belief that there are thoughts, or that there are people, or that people, if there are people, they have any value. And I think philosophers, we sort of delight in darkening our minds to certain things. This is, my wife and I talk about these things a lot, and we've come up with this phrase of like, we can darken our mind to certain things so we can explore certain pathways. But it's like you said, Bill, it's like tectonic plates, because you're shifting around big ideas that really do touch us. Like, oh, well, if there are no people, or if people have no value, then either I don't exist or I'm worthless. It's hard to just like think about that just dispassionately and just rationally, right? It's hard to do that. But if you can almost like darken your mind to certain things that feel obvious, and just, as you were saying, Drew, kind of be willing to be wrong, like help me see what I'm missing, then you can explore these pathways. And I think you come out with greater insight if you can do that. Insight into the implications. Yeah.
That brings up a very interesting point, and that is, I think you've said a couple times, including, to my 2 + 2 = 4 query, that we can find the truth, or we can.
Yes.
I don't know if you would say we can know that it's right, but
I would. I think it is possible to know that there are thoughts, and that 2 + 2 = 4. I think so.
So how would you separate that from always having that thought that I might be wrong?
I think you can integrate it in the following way. I think you can always be, in your heart of hearts, just willing to see more. And even while you feel certain, this is what I find like on Twitter, because Twitter is a good challenge for me, because there are people who haven't gone very far in reading some of these topics, but they display a lot of confidence. And especially if they display a lot of confidence, it's like there's this combination that I find difficult. It's when somebody hasn't studied something very much, and they're very confident, and they convey negative feelings towards the person they're disagreeing with. That combination of not looking very deeply into it, being confident, and then disdaining those. Now, what I find is that in that situation, I can't control them, so I can only control myself. So if they're disagreeing with me about something that I think is probably true, and I use the example of having thoughts because I think most people can relate to that. Like, okay, that's probably true. They say, Josh, you've made errors, like that's just terrible. What, you can't think that, I've noticed, and I don't always do this, okay, but I've noticed that if I can actually just kind of hold on to my desire to resist that and just get curious, and just like, well, why are you thinking that? Like, how are you understanding me? Like, what am I missing? And I have to say, I've always, when I've sustained that attitude of curiosity, discovered something new. It's not that, I discovered that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4 or something. I mean, that's possible too, but I've at least discovered something new about how somebody's thinking about something, how one can look at something this way. And sometimes the discoveries are implications, like, okay, if reality is fundamentally made of matter, and if matter is this way, then by this chain of reasoning, there would be no thoughts. That's a very interesting connection. In fact, hey, I might borrow that. I might make an argument against matter being fundamentally, against the world being fundamentally mindless matter, using that argument from the premise that there are thoughts. And so I think just staying curious, you can be willing to be wrong even while you feel certain. I think it is possible to do that. I don't think you have to separate that. It personally seems to me. I could be wrong about that.
I don't want
your
to.
impression? Sorry.
I want to let Bill jump in here.
Well, I have lots of questions. I was going to say is it just very quickly, is it your impression that a lot of people who are in the philosophical world, you're going to philosophy conferences, are they just curious? And that's really ultimately at bottom, all that really is motivating them primarily, rather than all the competition and egos and stuff like that.
It's sort of dangerous for me to speak for others, but my impression is that there's a curiosity drive and even a kind of collaboration and a friendliness toward each other. I was telling you before the show that I feel like there is a version or a vision of what philosophers do that gets filtered through social media and YouTube and online interactions that doesn't feel to me it really matches what it's like when I'm going to conferences and giving a talk or going to somebody else's talk. It feels like the core drive for philosophers, and I guess it's easier for me to speak for myself, but this is the feeling I have with my friends, is we're just curious. Like, we want to understand things more. We want to untangle things more. And there might even be this weird selection effect where, because a lot of us are also maybe a little bit kind of in our heads and maybe a little bit introverted, so we're not going onto social media. We're not displaying ourselves, and I almost like wonder if there's a little bit of a selection effect where those of us who maybe are a little bit more active online then will enter into the trenches of those maybe combat situations, and there's value in that. I mean, there's a kind of playful banter, and I see value in that, but the idea of just getting together and exploring something and tracing out an idea, that's what I love, and I feel like that is kind of hidden behind the scenes. I think a lot of people don't really see that because of the sort of way that social media, I think, filters what we do.
I suppose because it's mass media, the inevitable result, right, is that the masses are not, I mean, they're not reading the literature. They're not reading primary sources. They're not reading secondary sources. They're relying on people who are champions to sort of represent them in the arena that they can root for and feel like vicariously they're better because they hold similar ideas and they're winning the day. And,
That's it.
You know, I guess that sort of is what's animating a lot of it, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I think absolutely right. And I have to say, when I went to graduate school and I first started reading the journals, I mean, I had read a few things before then, but going deeper and reading these things, I was impressed by this kind of like friendliness and a certain style of interacting. Now, it's not universal. You know, we definitely have our tribal tendencies. We're all human beings, of course, and so we do that in our own ways. But here's something I think a lot of people don't realize: what philosophers, we give each other points, like reputation points, and we get points if we interact with each other in ways that are like humble and careful. So there's actually a weird way in which you can get almost like tribal around the value of being humble and careful. So it's like this kind of irony. But like in the popular sphere, it's almost the opposite. Like, you get points if you're sort of confident and triumphal. And so because there's those two different value systems at work, they don't really mix very well together. And I think maybe they serve different purposes. Because I like how you put it, Bill. It's like, if you're championing an idea, it's probably good for you to present yourself, you know, as confidently as you really are, so you're being honest. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're exploring a new pathway, you're at the edge of your own thinking, it's not very helpful to say, well, here's the truth. It's like you're having philosophers. We all often say to each other, help me see what I'm missing. And that's like our style. It's like a way, it's not a way of winning. It's a way of exploring together. It's like, well, help me see what I'm missing. And then we go further.
It's crazy. My wife and I were having this conversation just this morning, and I guess Twitter is the easiest scapegoat in the world, but it was about someone I follow that I was like, can you believe this guy has 5,000 people following him? He only speaks in like 4-word, shouting sentences and says things that seem like he's got ultimate confidence in it, when I know for a fact that he has no idea what he's talking about, and it gets the most engagement. So I totally agree with exactly what y'all are saying, and I can understand. The philosophers that I've met would be sort of the polar opposite of that.
Yeah. I was gonna say, Drew, you definitely would fit right in to those coffee conversations with the philosophers, because we are all kind of in resistance to that kind of confidence, almost to the point of being to fault, because sometimes I would have to notice if I'm presenting myself like more unsure or more humbly than I really feel, and then that's not a virtue either. That's not honest. So
yeah.
I have to like pay attention, and I've been really just doing that. Like, just pay attention. Okay, how sure I am. Let me present myself as sure, not any more and not any less. Because you're right. Yeah, philosophers, we like the sort of exploration. We don't want to be too confident.
So am I right? You're teaching at a Christian university, isn't it?
It's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So you I guess have some. You identify as a Christian in what, like in the traditional way or a C.S. Lewis way, or what's the?
Yeah. I mentioned before the show, I think, that C.S. Lewis has this concept of mere Christianity, and I kind of resonate with this idea. The word mere has to do with kind of identifying. I'm not sure I even really like that word, identifying, but kind of being connected to the essential core. So, there are specifics, theological specifics that I would think about, and viewpoints that I have. But I feel like one of my roles is to be kind of a bridge builder. And so while I'll definitely love to talk about those specifics, I wanted to kind of emphasize our common ground. And I do that beyond Christianity as well. So in this dialogue book I had with a philosopher on the existence of God, it's called Is God the Best Explanation of Things? I loved that dialogue because at the end of the book, we uncovered, I thought was just a beautiful common ground that I didn't even know was there. It was kind of hidden behind maybe the way we talk about things. It was like, oh, well, together we believe there's this fundamental reality, and it has the principles of a kind of mathematical landscape built in its nature, or built into it somehow, and it has even some kind of ability to intend, or something like this that can allow for there to be conscious beings. So there was a lot of overlap there, and I love to explore that overlap. So yeah, I mean, I would identify with the kind of C.S. Lewis mere Christianity.
So won't that be I'm sure you've heard this maybe about 1,000 times, that if you have this sort of core doctrinal set of beliefs, whatever you called it, that you share, can you really do philosophy? I mean, isn't that essentially blunting your curiosity, and you can only be curious so much? And I ask that not to be sort of like just the I'm not just trying to play devil's advocate. I'm just thinking for me as a Christian, and I know, Drew, when you identify as a Christian, I think you were going through the same things, where you're sort of like, I don't want to go crazy. I don't want to feel like I'm going off the reservation. Although I will say, as a little caveat, I do think when I was an atheist, I still had sort of like limits to where I was like, I didn't want to seem crazy, go off what seemed just weird off of what most people thought. So anyway, how would you respond to that, Josh?
Yeah, I like the question. It reminds me actually of Drew's question, like, can you be willing to be wrong and feel like you know something? I think you can actually work on those intellectual virtues of taking somebody else's perspective, rechecking your steps, being sort of open to being wrong, revising your beliefs, and still having beliefs. So I think that is possible. But I also want to kind of put a note on a certain kind of maybe culture that I see that does create a fence. And I've experienced this where people say, hey, don't go past that fence. Like, you can explore up to that fence, but once you get to that fence, then if you go past that, it's dangerous. It could lead you into error. And I think there's a way in which maybe every large enough group of people who have ideas that they have a lot of value to will have these like fences at the perimeter that in their mind is sort of dangerous to go past that fence. And I don't know if it's like my personality or what it is, but like I love to go to the fence, and if somebody says, hey, you can't go past there, I'm going to kick it down and like, no, there's flowers out here, let's go explore. Oh, there's weeds, okay, there's snakes, and there's this beautiful tree over here, you guys don't even know about that. And so I mean, I don't think I can overemphasize just how valuable it is and how fun it is to just like test everything. Just, you can test everything. You don't have to hold any belief sacred. And I think that sometimes my friends who are more skeptical of the existence of God, they would feel like believers in God represent certain values of maybe following reason only so far as it supports their prior beliefs, this kind of rationalization, not going past those fences. And then those skeptical friends, they're saying, hey, but there's another way. We can actually have the courage to face reality. And I mean, I love that. Like, I think that's so important. Like, I really feel like that sets people free to see more and more and more. So that's how I would kind of combine those two. It's like, sure, you can have beliefs. And for me, I guess I just really do just want to let everything be open for testing. Even whether, okay, because this may sound weird, but like, what about the existence of my wife? I think I know that she exists and I love her. Am I willing to doubt that she exists? Yeah, I'm willing to become a skeptic of her existence. I'm reading these Eliminativist materialists and I'm trying to understand, okay, maybe my wife doesn't exist in the way I thought she did. That doesn't mean that I can't know that she exists. So I think there's a way of combining those. And if I could just add one more thing here, I think sometimes, because before the show you were talking a little bit about pragmatic reasons versus maybe philosophical reasons. And I think there are these sort of pragmatic, I think of them as psychological currents that are deeper than the philosophical trees that grow up out of the currents. And I think that it took me a while to really see these currents and appreciate their forces. But I think one of the currents that leads a lot of people to maybe be skeptical of certain viewpoints that are more associated with religion would be some of these core values of like being willing to be wrong, having the courage to face reality, not just holding certainty of beliefs, but actually letting the evidence sort of update your mind. And then if those values are cut off from a broadly theistic worldview or a Christian worldview, then it kind of presents this sort of, I think, unfortunate choice, because then you want to sort of follow the currents. And please hear me, I'm not trying to give a psychological analysis of why all skeptics become skeptical. I'm speaking from my own experience when the belief in God was washed away by the sea of ideas, and I felt this worry that people who believe in God are associating that they themselves are exhibiting a kind of a groupthink. That's how I felt. Mm-hmm. So that's my story. That's my journey. And then for me, it was just very liberating to see that that I don't have to make that choice. I can just follow the evidence wherever it leads, and if it leads me to a greater vision of reality, including even a vision of God at the foundation of reality, I can follow the evidence there. But then even there's social pressure, especially among philosophers, because if you arrive in your own journey at some beliefs that feel like they are associated with religion, then in my experience, there's a lot of resistance to that, maybe a lot of distrust. So it's like, oh, well, maybe I don't really care about the truth. And so I feel a lot of social pressure on that side as well.
I suppose because it's so, in one sense, it's so obvious that a figure like Socrates, who you're sort of describing a philosopher and to me what strikes me is a very Socratic sort of approach to life. The unexamined life isn't worth living and so on. But when you go to read Plato versus Paul, the apostle, one of the marked differences is the degree of confidence with which Paul asserts absolute truths that, just sort of knock all the other chess pieces off the board. So there does seem to be sort of a historical tension just between the very images of like a Socrates versus an Apostle Paul. And I didn't mention Jesus, but Jesus was a lot more confident than just sort of seeking things out.
Yeah, the science and religion kind of has these tendencies. The scientists are the explorers. The religious people sort of already know the truth. And then there's a feeling like you have to choose between them. But, I mean, I love this sort of style of exploration. And I think that there's always a balance to things. I think that just like you can be willing to be wrong, you can still feel like you know something. You can know that 1 + 1 = 2. And still be willing to be wrong. So I think you don't have to necessarily choose between those, it seems to me.
Yeah, I don't think so either. One of the benefits of reading the early church fathers is that a lot of early church fathers were from a philosophical background.
Yeah, true.
So you get some really interesting merges. Like Origen was a really interesting philosophical-minded guy who also did a ton of theology and also like got into the texts and the manuscripts and things like this. So I think that's lost a lot on a sort of modern concept of Christianity in your typical American sort of context. Is we don't really see the two blending much. Where some of the most famous early church fathers, St. Augustine and so on, were highly philosophical in the way they approached their theology. Even
it's very true. Yeah, I remember when I was at Notre Dame. Yeah, just reading a lot of this from history and just being very impressed by the interaction with the sort of ideas, the philosophical ideas. And that impressed me, especially because I came out of some particular churches that I had gone to, not necessarily in my childhood, but later, really emphasize almost like turning off your mind and the suspicion of thinking carefully. And but reading these early, as you say, church fathers, definitely kind of breaks that stereotype.
Bill, I'm just curious how you would square the idea, just being the skeptic on the podcast and you being the Christian. If you would agree with Josh, because I feel like I do to some extent, about believing that 1 + 1 = 2 and feeling like that's something that you know and that is certain, and yet being willing to doubt that. For me, I have a hard time. I think Josh can talk about that more easily than I can. I don't know in what way, and again, I'm coming as the skeptic, and I don't know in what way I can really doubt that, other than, as we were talking about, you can doubt that it can be extrapolated from one concept to another. But if we're talking about an apple and another apple, I don't, there seems to be a reducible level of thought that I can't really doubt, even though I try.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think I associate very well with what he's saying, but I'm applying it while he's talking. Well, Josh, you're talking, I'm applying it to my own sort of field, the classics, and thinking about how I'm interested in the truth of what actually happened historically and what a writer originally meant. And and I feel totally open and genuinely curious to everybody being wrong that I've been listening to, and just trying to read it as simply as possible for what it means. And if that knocks out a bunch of stuff I thought was right, I feel totally comfortable with that. So that's kind of the way I would see that, Drew. And as far as the way I'm applying it, like the way people have ideas of like inerrancy or infallibility of Scripture, or even simple things like, did Matthew write the Gospel of Matthew? I find myself, when I'm delving into the original historical evidence for that, a complete blank slate. Like, I'm just interested in, where does the evidence point? It doesn't matter to me that everybody calls this book the Gospel of Matthew. I want to know, I really want to know the truth here. And it doesn't, and you have to be open to it shaking out in a way that's not what you thought, and and yet still feeling like you could land on something that's closer to the truth or something. So that's kind of how I apply what he's saying. But in terms of, because none of us are really, well, actually, Josh, you probably are walking around doubting 2 + 2 occasionally. Most people who are not practicing philosophers, those aren't their frontier issues, right? Their frontier issues are on other things like moral questions. I mean, Drew and I had tried to do a podcast on abortion, right? Drew and I, to just the two of us sitting down talking about abortion, and it was hard, a lot harder than I think either of us thought it was going to be, to just sit there by ourselves and just talk about this topic, even though at no point were we, there's no point, I think, where there was like a problem. It was just a complete conversation like this is, but I think both of us agreed at the end of that. We haven't really even talked about it a ton since then, but both of us agreed we're not really sure. There's still a lot of things we want to think through about that, almost to a point where our conversation we weren't ready for a real conversation about that yet. I don't know if, Drew, that's how your interpretation of it is.
No, I mean, I think that's a good example. Like, I certainly didn't come into that thinking it would be simple, and yet it was more. I came away thinking neither of us were qualified to have the conversation. You know, it was
that's probably true. Yeah,
it was an increasing of the skepticism, and so, Josh, back to your point. You know, there are things that you know I struggle to be skeptical with, and there's another way with everything that Bill said, and concepts and people's beliefs and opinions and people's interpretations of history and the world. Absolutely, I think we can all see, but like your example about your wife's existence, or 2 + 2 = 4, seem to be in a different category to me somehow, and I don't know. It's funny that I, the skeptic, am asking the two of you how to be more skeptical, but that's
I think
interesting place that I find myself.
Yeah, Drew, I really appreciate this because I want to I'm curious to explore something. So, imagine if there grew a culture of skeptics of 2 + 2 = 4, and you're labeled the believer. Okay, that's your label because you believe that. And so online there's even these sort of conversations about how the believers look at that. They present themselves so confidently. They have tweets where they say it's true that it's proven. Look at these proofs. And then the skeptics are like, well, look at, they're trusting their intuitions, but those scientifically are not reliable, and so they're offering these skeptical arguments, and maybe you're curious about them, but you might feel maybe the way that maybe the way that Bill might feel sometimes about some of his beliefs, right? Because, or maybe I should speak for myself, but I think that what happens to me is that there are some things that I feel pretty confident of just from my own thinking through of it. And then there are others who are skeptical of that. And then I feel, maybe this is due to my own insecurities, that they're attributing to me maybe that I'm not willing to be wrong or not courageous enough to face reality. And then I almost want to give these examples to maybe display a little bit more of what it's like to be me in a way that others can relate to. Because you can relate to, Drew, the idea that 2 + 2 = 4 is hard to be willing to be wrong about. And yet you could still want to be, having that virtue of being willing to be wrong and facing reality. And especially if people were associating the value and the virtue of being willing to be wrong with skepticism of mathematics. And that was a constant association. And then you might want to feel no, I agree with those values. I feel like I'm connected to you in that. And yet still I find myself over here believing these mathematical principles. I think if I try to get very transparent with myself, I think maybe I do have a little bit of that desire, almost to show that here's how it feels to be me sometimes, when I do feel like there are some pathways of thinking that make it so that certain views about reality feel the way that 2 + 2 = 4 could feel. It's I can't help but think that is true and even be kind of confident that it's true. But hey, I could be wrong. I'll keep rechecking my steps. I don't know if that kind of makes sense, what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't think we would go this far into, epistemology, and
this is definitely the deepest philosophical weeds we've gotten into. But I don't know why we would have been, and psychology. Right. I don't know why we'd be surprised about that, since we're interviewing a philosopher.
Sorry, guys.
but it's very interesting, and it just got me thinking. And I admit that there are things that I am more and less skeptical about.
Yeah.
even in the face of realizing that most things I'm going to have a probability of how certain I am about it. Is this chair going to hold me up? Probably 99 point something.
Yeah.
Other things much less, and 2 + 2 is approaching that limit, limit line.
Yeah. Same for
Don't
me.
you think don't you think age plays a role in your level of interest or curiosity, though, Drew, or your how skeptical you really want to be? Because you just a sort of a point where you're because he was saying earlier, Josh, right? I think if I understood you, that your journey, in a way, is sort of more important than just the philosophy, if I understood you correctly. So maybe you're just maybe you would have been a lot more excited about that potential doubt, that skepticism of 2 + 2 = 4 when you were 27, and you've gone on a little bit since then, and it's kind of like, I don't want to go back to worrying about that, because otherwise you feel like you have nothing certain.
Yeah, well, if I could just add here, I think it's easy for us to maybe project into other people how plausible things seem to us. So there are some things that I was talking with somebody this morning, actually, drawing out the implications of a view, and then he said to me, and then that would be absurd. And I actually agree, like, in the sense that it does look absurd to me, but that doesn't mean that it actually literally looks absurd in somebody else's mind. And I think we do that to each other. We judge how plausible things are in our own mind. We judge other people's minds, and we say, well, they can't be rational because they're not believing this thing, or they are believing this thing that's absurd. And I just want to emphasize, this is not a relativism about truth. Like, there is a correct answer and there are errors. But that's very different from the sort of quality of thinking, because you can have a quality of thinking that, from your own perspective, it is just so plausible in the way that 2 + 2 = 4 feels plausible to all of us. The opposite might feel plausible to somebody else, given their total considerations. And it doesn't mean it's all relative. There's no correct answer. There's no way to resolve the disagreement. But I think it highlights something special about what you guys do on this show, which is you get together on the divide. People are divided about things where there are people who can feel very sure of opposite viewpoints. And I don't think you actually have to be agnostic to respect each other's rationality. I think you could actually sustain your own sureness in your convictions and still disagree and still respect each other's rationality. I think that's possible. I think you guys demonstrate that.
So in this case, instead of there being a divide where there's like two roads, it's more like Schrodinger's cat. I think Josh has made like one road, the other one doesn't exist, and this one does exist and cannot not exist, or something. I'm not quite sure.
It exists and doesn't exist. It's indeterminate.
Well,
Yeah,
I'm
it's
fully
indeterminate.
confused.
Yeah.
But no, I think that's a great. I hope we do that. I hope that's the idea, because I do think that in a way that some skeptics or atheists or whatever, I think may come to a conclusion that I would agree with, but do it in exactly the wrong way. I see Bill coming to another conclusion, but doing it in an honest and thoughtful way, and then we've always tried to. I think we've just naturally brought out that in each other. So it's been a fun journey. I appreciate you joining us today, Josh. Lots of things that I would never have thought came out of your mouth. So that's been super interesting just from where I sit.
Yeah, fascinating. Really have enjoyed the conversation, and actually wish we could just carry on because I have a few more questions, but I do think it's probably a good time to wrap up just because we came to a nice closure there. Well, I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, The Divide by iPub. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.